Welcome to the Versus History Podcast with your hosts, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Connell Smith, and Elliot Watson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of the Versus History Podcast. It's me, your host, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, at History Chappie on behalf of the Versus History editors. And today we are joined by John Leshy, who became deeply involved with America's public lands soon after his graduation from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He was solicitor for the US Department of the Interior from 1993 up to 2001. And John is the co-author of the standard textbook on public land and resources law. He is the Emeritus Professor at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in sunny San Francisco. And he's just about to publish in February 2022 via Yale University Press his brand new book entitled Our Common Ground. John, welcome to Versus History, and I hope that introduction did you justice.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here.
Not as delighted as we are to have you. So tell us, John, let's get straight into it. Tell us about you and your background and this brand new book. Over to you.
Well, I have devoted much of my professional career, last half century or so, to America's public lands. And by that, I mean the lands that are owned and managed by the national government, not by the states, not by private citizens, but by the national government, which comprises about 30%, almost 1/3 of the lands in the United States. And since I've devoted much of my career to these lands, I have over the years become aware of a lot of misconceptions about these lands and how the United States came to control them and own them. And so I thought I would help set the record straight by writing a comprehensive history of these lands, starting with the American Revolution back in the 1770s. When I talk about the public lands to various audiences, I'll tell them that the United States remarkably manages about 1/3 of the land in the country, which is really remarkable in a country that believes in private property and individual freedom and distrusts government. So how did that happen? That's what people always ask. How did it happen that the United States ended up with 1/3 of the lands in the country? And so my book tries to tell the story of how that happened.
Absolutely fascinating. I wasn't anywhere near aware that the US federal government owned 33.3% of the land in America. Astounding. I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit later. Just a random question, just to break the ice, and so our listeners can get to know the John behind the academia. Here's a random question for you. If you could only ever visit one restaurant ever again for the rest of your life, John, which restaurant would it be? Where is it, in case we want to visit it, and why?
Well, that's really a kind of a curveball question, because I love to eat and I love restaurants. And I would say if there was just one, it may be Balthazar in New York City. I spent some time there over the years, and Balthazar is a great restaurant near Greenwich Village, and I always have a very good time and good food when I go there, and I have very warm memories of meeting family and friends there. And so that's the one that comes to mind about the one restaurant I would go to if I only had to go to one.
Great choice. Thanks, John. Okay, and back to your work then. Let's get to the definition then. What do we mean exactly by public lands, and why do you think now is an important time to educate Americans and people globally on the history and importance of America's collective lands?
Well, as I said, these are lands that the title of these lands is in the United States of America. They're owned collectively by all the people in the country. And so that's what we mean. They're managed actually by 4 different governmental agencies. And some of your listeners may have heard of some of these: national parks, the National Park System, the U.S. Forest System, National Forests. There's a system of national wildlife refuges, and then the rest of them are managed collectively under an agency called the Bureau of Land Management, BLM. And so these 4 different agencies managed these lands, but basically they managed them all for the same broad public objectives. And they're used primarily for recreation, for conservation, for education, for scientific investigation, for open space, and for inspiration. So they have very broad objectives for their management. Some of them are logged and some of them are mined, and their resources are exploited in various ways, but overwhelmingly, the vast majority of them are used for these broad conservation purposes. Now, why is it an important time to educate Americans about the history and the importance of these lands? Very good question. And I think there are several reasons. One is these lands, the history of these lands is often misunderstood. And there are a number of myths that have grown up about these lands that just frankly don't comport with the history. The history shows these to be myths. One of the myths is that these lands have always been a divisive force in American life, that they have tended to divide us, not unite us. And the history actually shows the opposite, that from the very beginning, these lands have served a unifying force. They tend to bring the people together. That's one of the reasons I called the book Our Common Ground, because these lands have been places where Americans can unite around. Another myth about the history is that the United States came to own these lands through a kind of a land grab, where the national government came in and snatched these lands away from states and local interests and private interests. Again, totally a myth. That's not how it happened. These lands were kept and more lands were acquired by the national government with the strong support of state and local interests and the people at large from the very beginning. We have, for example, national forests and national parks in the eastern United States that were acquired by the national government from private interests at the request of local citizens. And in some places, like Everglades in Florida and Big Bend National Park in Texas, two well-known national parks, the state and local interests actually bought the lands and donated them to the national government to manage. So the history is contrary to this myth of a land grab. It wasn't a land grab and hasn't been a land grab. Another myth is that the public lands tend to divide Americans along partisan lines. In modern era, we're kind of used to thinking of all public policy issues as Republican and Democrat, right and left, red and blue. When you look at the history of public lands, almost all the major decisions made about the public lands over the last 240 years have been bipartisan, not partisan. It's Republicans and Democrats together, not apart. And that's an important, exploding these myths is a very important thing to do, I think, especially in our modern times when we are polarized and we have think that every issue is something that we argue about and divide about. If you look at the history of the public lands, it's really largely the opposite. As I said, a place where Americans have tended to come together and not be divided. So those are really important reasons for writing the book, to elucidate the history and explain and explode these myths. At the same time, these lands, like all of us, like the whole planet, in fact, are facing some big challenges: climate change, loss of biodiversity. And so it's important to understand the history of these lands, because I think they have some useful lessons about how the United States and how humanity at large should confront these challenges of global challenges, climate change and biodiversity loss. The world is not going to learn how to deal with the destabilizing climate unless we acknowledge that it's in all of our collective interest to address this problem. And our collective interest must outweigh the sort of parochial, narrower private interests. And America's public lands are a great example of where that has been done. It's really, if you look at the long sweep of history, a huge governmental success story. We're kind of, I think many people all over the world are sort of find it puzzling to think of a governmental success story these days, because there's so much distrust and disrespect for government. And so I think there's hope that one can find in the history of America's public lands as an example of where government has worked to make decisions and achieve results that most people greatly support. If you ask people in the United States, in any region, including especially regions where there are large amounts of public lands, and the American West comes to mind because much of the land in the western part of the United States is public land. If you ask people at the ground level, what do you think of the public lands? And should we get rid of them? Should we privatize them? Should we turn them over to the states? You will find a massive opposition across the political spectrum. No, we like our public lands. Leave them alone. We want them protected. We want them managed in the collective public interest. So that's a really important lesson, I think. How we did this. This is a political success story, and in today's cynical, polarized world, I think political success stories are important to tell, and the American public lands story is a great political success story.
Absolutely, and political success stories are in pretty much short supply. I'm sure we would agree on all sides of the Atlantic and all around the world. Okay, let's dig into this climate change issue, because it's obviously huge news, and it's a contemporary challenge that we're facing. So how can US management of public lands, both past and in present, inform us as we confront climate change? What do you think?
Well, for one thing, a major cause of the climate problem is fossil fuel carbon emissions, primarily from fossil fuels. Now here, the history of public lands has some interesting lessons. We have mined a lot of coal from public lands, and we have drilled for oil and gas on America's public lands. That's been an important source of electricity and energy for the United States, as it has been all over the world. We are now in the middle of a great transition away from fossil fuels, and the public lands are playing a kind of a leadership role in that effort. Now, in America, the public lands supply have traditionally supplied about half of our coal produced nationally, and about a quarter or so of our oil and gas. We are now winding those down as the world, the United States and the world in general must transition away must decarbonize, must transition away from fossil fuels. A great line that I like to use that was used, I think first said by Sheikh Yamani in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia about 40 years ago. The Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of stones. The Stone Age ended because we found better ways of doing things. You could say the same thing about the carbon age and about the fossil fuel age. The fossil fuel age is not going to end because we run out of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel age is going to end because we have found better ways to do things, better ways to produce and use energy. And that's happening with the public lands right now. For example, and by the way, when I speak of public lands in the United States, I include the offshore areas. Submerged lands off our coasts are actually managed by the national government. And those are places where we have traditionally drilled for oil and gas, but we are now licensing and putting in wind platforms offshore, as well as onshore, and solar energy onshore on public land. So the public lands in the United States are a kind of leading edge in the transition away from fossil fuels. And so that is an important lesson for for how we deal with the climate problem. A closely related problem is the loss of biodiversity. The problem of endangered species and losing our rich natural wild heritage in animals and plants that are so important to the overall functioning of the planet. Many of your listeners perhaps know that there's a movement afoot among all the world's nations to protect 30% of the planet's land and marine areas by the year 2030. It's called the 30 by 30 movement. And the idea is to put in place protections that will sustain the important long-term biodiversity of the planet. Well, in the United States, a very important part of that 30 by 30 movement, a very important part of the protection end are the public lands. Many of our public lands are already protected from intensive forms of development, like drilling and mining and logging and that sort of thing. And we will have to see more of that to get to the 30 by 30 goal. So here too, the public lands will be a very important part of dealing with these challenges.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, then moving on to this question. What is the significance, do you think, of President Biden's naming of Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary, which will make her the first Native American to hold a cabinet post in the United States of America?
Well, it's a very important moment. It's a signal event, really, when you think about it, in the relationship between Native Americans, the indigenous peoples in the United States, and the public lands. Now, my book does not deal at any length with the complex story of how the European invaders came to North America and South America, and how in North America their successor, the United States, dispossessed the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, American Indians they're often called, dispossessed them from their lands and acquired formal title to these lands by treaties and other agreements. That process certainly had its share of injustice and frankly dishonorable behavior by the US government. It also varied considerably from place to place. Usually settlers and speculators and miners and others would throw the Native Americans off the lands, and then the United States would come along and negotiate treaties to get title to the land. My book doesn't talk about that in any detail, nor in any detail about how the US came to acquire large amounts of territory from Great Britain, Spain, France, Mexico, and Russia through conflicts and deals like the Louisiana Purchase and the purchase of Alaska. These are fundamentally different stories from the story that I'm telling. And they've been a subject of a number of good books. The heart of the story I tell begins around 1890, which was when the US government launched a major effort to hold on to large amounts of land permanently in national ownership. And that was after, usually quite years and decades after Native Americans had been dispossessed of their lands. Nevertheless, Native Americans, American Indian tribes, usually never relinquished their interest and their strong cultural attachment to their ancestral lands. And my book does explore in some detail how, particularly in the decades after World War II, Indian tribes and nations began demanding and winning a greater consideration by the federal land managers of their values and their interests and their traditions in how these lands are managed. And there are a number of modern examples of sort of success stories here. Perhaps some of your listeners know a bit about the so-called Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. This is more than 1 million acres of land that President Obama added protections to in 2016 in response to a petition by a consortium of Indian tribes that had ancestral interests in, these were their ancestral lands. And they wanted this area protected because it still has a lot of importance to them for ceremonies, for gathering. A lot of the remnants of their predecessors are found on these lands. And so President Obama set aside these lands and gave them permanent protection, and also gave that consortium of Indian tribes a management role, set up a commission that they would have great influence on how these lands were managed. So they've been given a formal role, and that's happened in several different places. And in a few places where a particular tribe or tribes have very strong attachment to and history with particular lands, sometimes Congress has actually given the tribes the lands back. Most recent example was just last year. Congress passed a bill that gave a place in northwestern Montana, the so-called National Bison Range, back to the local Indian tribes because they had long managed these lands and had been attached to these lands. And so Congress said, given all those circumstances, even though the United States had bought these lands from the tribes 100 years ago, it's now appropriate to give those lands back for those particular reasons. So there are lots going on in this area in terms of bringing new respect and new coordination and collaboration between federal land managers and Indian tribes with particular attachments to the land. So given all that context, for President Biden to name Deb Haaland, Native American from New Mexico, to become the Secretary of the Interior is really a momentous kind of decision. And she's the first Native American to hold any cabinet post. And the cabinet post that she holds, which is the Department of the Interior, is the agency that manages most, not all, but most of America's public lands. So she's definitely in a position to have strong influence over what public land policy will be in the future. And she's already indicated or already achieved in her several months in office a number of changes in direction and policy to make it more sensitive to and respectful of the interests of Native Americans. So it's a major step forward, and it will be very interesting to see how things work out in the next few years on that front.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Okay, next question then. What do you think are the most important things that need to be done or could be done today with regard to America's public lands?
First of all, the agencies that manage these lands need more financial and political support. As I said, they face huge challenges making this transition away from fossil fuels, expanding protections for biodiversity, and they have very small budgets. Even though it's almost 1/3 of the land of the country, these four federal agencies combined, their budgets total about 1/3 of 1% of the total federal budget. And their personnel is only about 3% of the US government's total civilian workforce. So we've been kind of managing these lands on the cheap, as it were, and they're facing big challenges, and frankly, they need more money. Another challenge they face is that, particularly with the pandemic, or even leading up to the pandemic, the use of these lands for ordinary outdoor recreation, people going to visit these places and to have really life-changing encounters with nature and recreation, exploring the national parks and the history of these lands. There's been a huge increase in the last few decades in the public visitation of these lands. Give you an example, the Grand Canyon, which is one of the signaled iconic national parks, it had got about 1 million visitors a year about 15, 20 years ago. Then it doubled to 2 million, then it doubled again to 4 million, And in the last few years, the annual visitation has gone to 6 million. So you've really seen a steep spike in the use of these lands by ordinary Americans. They are open to all. This is a great equalizer. These lands are available and accessible to all at zero or very modest cost. And people are taking advantage of it. And obviously with the pandemic, there's even more reason not to get on an airplane, but to go to your nearest public land, refuge or park or forest or whatever, and hike and recreate. So these lands are kind of being overwhelmed in recent years by visitation. And so they need the agencies that have to manage these hordes of people. And believe me, I endorse this. The visitation is important. I mean, these lands are there to inspire and offer opportunities for recreation. And remember, the root of the word recreation is to recreate oneself, is to find new meaning in one's life through these outdoor experiences that many people do. So we need to encourage the recreation, but managing these vast numbers of people is a real challenge. And so these agencies need more support, particularly financial support. And that's a very important thing to do. And then, of course, dealing with the climate problem and the biodiversity problem that I've mentioned, these need to be elevated even higher in the objectives of why we're managing these lands. This is happening, and it's happening, but it needs to happen faster. I say it is happening, and to go back to a point I made earlier, we tend to think of these lands as divisive and driving people apart. But in fact, if you look at even recent history, Congress has taken steps in the right direction, even though Congress is divided on many issues and the Republicans and the Democrats are yelling at each other constantly. On public lands issues, they have continued to find common ground. Donald Trump, in some ways, his presidency was he was the most exploitation-minded. He wanted to industrialize more public lands than any modern president. Now, he failed at that, by and large, because the people didn't want it. He wanted to, drill for oil and gas in lots of places, and in most places, the local people rose up and said, "We don't want that," and stopped his efforts. Donald Trump also signed into law in 2019 and 2020 two major, bold steps to add to the nation's public lands base and to put more money into their management. So even though he was sort of seen as an exploiter, he also signed into law without a lot of fanfare, but he did it. Two big bipartisan bills that had support across the entire political spectrum to both add to the nation's land base, public land base, and to put more money into their management. So I'm, reasonably optimistic about the future of public lands, because this long-standing tradition of bipartisan grassroots support for their management remains intact. And I want to tell the story in the book so that people will understand how this all happened and why it remains so important.
Wow, a political story, or at least a story with some political undertones and ramifications that isn't wholly negative. Thank you very much indeed. Save that, listeners. Save that date. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, is there anything else then, John, that you would like to have said or you'd like to reaffirm that the questions didn't give you the chance to talk about?
No, I think I've managed to say all the important points. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the public lands because, as you indicated, there's something. They're a truly American institution that people don't really know very much about. Even though, as I said, almost one out of every 3 acres in the country is owned and managed by the national government, but that's a pretty hidden fact. And so I think it's important that people understand that and understand, more importantly, why and how that happened and why there are lessons here for all of us, really, for humanity collectively to learn from the story of American public lands, our common ground. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure. So Versus History listeners, the book is entitled Our Common Ground, and it will be published by Yale University Press, and it's released on the 8th of February in 2022. So if this podcast served as something of an hors d'oeuvre and you like what you heard, go and purchase this fabulous new book by John Leshy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Versus History, John. We were delighted to have you with us, and we hope you'll come back and join us at some point in the future.
Thank you very much. I'd like that opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Versus History podcast. Visit us at www.versushistory.com and follow us at Versus History on Twitter and Instagram. You can download all episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcasts.